Okay, so yeah, so eventually Rosa broke with Karl Kautsky. She wrote this really bitter article, a small book, denouncing him, really. I mean, and Kautsky moved more to the right. He kind of went off the rails as politics later. He got very weird, but he was a huge figure. And you read Lenin later on, wrote, the Proletarian Revolution, the Renegade Kautsky, which is the difference between like a social democrat and a communist, essentially. And there are other people in Lenin's works. He keeps talking about Lenin Kautsky was the center. Rosa and her friends were the left. Kautsky was the center. Okay, and later on, Kautsky really got off the rails, but okay. So, and Rosa broke with Kautsky. She still remained friends with Louise Kautsky and some of the women of the party leaders. She remained friends, and she kept trying to get them to stand up to their wimpy reformist husbands. That was kind of interesting. Okay, so what happened next? Okay, for a couple of years, not much happened. Then there was the big event, the Revolution of 1905, the Russian Revolution of 1905. It sent shockwaves around the world. Okay, one of the shockwaves, there was actually a revolution in Poland, revolution of 1905 in Poland. And Rosa went back. People, her friends advised her not to. She had to go under an assumed identity. She used someone else's passport. Rosa and Eutychus went back to Poland. It was, there was definitely a price on their heads. But Eutychus did organizing work, tried to organize. Rosa wrote some amazing articles about what was going on. Most of what we know about the Polish Revolution of 1905 is from Rosa Luxemburg's work. She wrote a series of amazing articles. She first noticed the revolution was ebbing she noticed this before anyone else. It's ebbing. It's not going to go anywhere. She picked this up. But okay, well, her cover was blown. I read different accounts of this one, that a conservative German magazine outed her, or another one that the Tsarist police had like an informant within the Social Democratic Party of the Kingdom of Poland, Lithuania, the informant. Both might have been true. Reminds me of, more interestingly, a previous video I talked about the Daily Beast, liberal, liberal online magazine. They outed this guy Gonzalo Lira, who has amazing videos on Ukraine situation. They basically tried to get him killed. And they're doing the same shit now. Interestingly, I think both Rosa Luxemburg and Gonzalo Lira would be a little amused to be compared to each other. But anyway, so they were both, Rosa and Leo were arrested. Leo Eutychus was, I believe, sentenced to a lifetime of hard labor in Siberia. While Rosa wasn't sentenced yet, but it didn't look too good. It didn't look too good for her. So they had friends in the SDP, even though they had a lot of political enemies by this time in the SDP. They did have friends, and they did people who you could basically buy your way out of jail in Tsarist Russia. They put up money. They either legally or I don't know how it went, but they paid for their release and they got out. And they had some amazing stories to tell what was going on. At the same time, there was what was called the German 1905. Influenced by the Russian Revolution of 1905, there was workers' uprising in Germany. It was set off by like women's suffrage, some issue concerning women's rights. Women weren't allowed to attend political assemblies, and they were restricted about where they could go. There was some women's suffrage, some complicated thing about women's suffrage, but this triggered a workers' uprising. It partly masked a lot of other issues, but there were wildcat strikes, workers occupied factories, there were street battles. And this was almost entirely, it was unexpected, came from nowhere. And it was outside of the control of either the SDP or the labor unions, or the unions. I also forgot, I was going to mention the material basis of reformism. This is a good time to mention it. As I said, the SDP was started, and it started a union movement in Germany. And the union movement could be a mass unions. There was ambiguity, debate about what their relationship was to the party. Officially, they were like a part of the party. Now, what the role of the union should be. And there's a powerful move Now, the union tops a powerful move to become reformists. They wanted, bread and butter issues. They wanted stuff that would work, higher, better conditions for their workers, bargaining, things like that. They weren't interested in revolutionary politics, which they thought probably not really possible anyway. They just wanted day-to-day better issues. And this is true, like the workers themselves were much more radical. Generally, the rank and file is much more radical. The leadership of the unions was fairly conservative. And this happens anywhere in the world. The union tops generally tend to be more conservative and generally try to put a brake on class struggle. American business unionism is like an extreme version of this. Another thing impelling the SDP making it more conservative was Southern Germany. Like Bavaria was Catholic, very conservative, had a capitalism was less well developed, still run by large landowners, and so there was when socialists, there was enormous pressure like to cooperate with liberals, like on the education budget. That was a big thing. Cooperate. If they didn't cooperate with liberals, like there would be no education budget. The Catholic Church opposed any of this. So there's enormous pressure to cooperate. And there was a big, huge, intense debate in the early German Socialist Party. Finally, it was kind of grudgingly admitted, yeah, you can have an exception, say to the socialists in Bavaria or the areas of Southern Germany. Yeah, you can work with liberals. It's okay. But the rest of Germany, no. And anyway, this is the material basis for this huge drive for reformism, which Bernsteinism was a reflection of it, the material basis. Okay. So in 1905, there's the German 1905. There's a workers' uprising. It was out of the control of the party and the unions. And there's a lot of debate. Rosa Luxemburg had a theory of, the theory of the mass strike. And she wrote a whole series of articles which triggered this huge debate. And the unions kind of opposed it. Basically, a mass strike isn't the same as a general strike. A mass strike is just a workers' uprising. Classic example is Seattle. In the U.S., like 1919, there was a mass strike. Workers in Seattle took over the city for like a few weeks. It fell apart. There was no real leadership. It fell apart, but workers influenced by the IWW or whatever just took over Seattle. It's not well known, but they took over Seattle. You can Google it. It took over Seattle for a few weeks. It collapsed eventually because it didn't really go anywhere. But so a mass strike, Rosa thought a mass strike, she thought it was like the working class was becoming consciousness of itself, was like learning. It was some process of self-education. She thought there's a dialectical process. And she talked about the role of the Revolutionary Party, and she disagreed with Lenin and came to different ideas of what a Revolutionary Party should be. Rosa thought the Revolutionary Party should not so much lead the working class as reflect, there's a process of dialectical process of self-education, and would be a means by which the working class could educate itself, to clarify things. She wrote 2 articles. The theory of the mass strike was one. I think the other one was something like spontaneity, the dialectics of spontaneities, is something like that. There are two big articles, kicked off this huge debate. And she was right in some ways, she was wrong in others. And I'm not explaining her theory of the mass strike that well, but she thought it was an educational thing where the working class could learn. And the unions saw their role as improving working conditions. Rosa saw more of their role as educating the workers for revolution, like an education thing. And there's a big fight on that. And the unions grudgingly said, yeah, the mass strike could be a tool in our arsenal, but we don't want to. They basically hated the idea of the mass, hated this theorizing. So where are we here? Okay, so yeah, 1907 was kind of what happened in 1907. First of all, she was close friends with Clara Zetkin, a feminist, socialist feminist, and Rosa organized with Clara Zetkin women's congress, like it annually met. They started International Women's Day, and started a huge women's demonstration for women's rights. And Rosa was a pioneer. She did write stuff about the women's struggle, the women's question, as it was then called. It's debatable whether Rosa could be considered a feminist. This is really complicated. And I'm not explaining this well, but really complicated. First, the feminist movement as such did not originally have a good reputation among socialists. It started in Britain and elsewhere, and it was generally for upper middle class women, and it was anti-working class. So it didn't have a good, socialists didn't have a good connotation generally among the socialist movement. They, of course, they of course supported women's rights or women's emancipation. They of course supported, but the idea, often a common idea, that the struggle for women's equality and would be subsumed under the struggle against capitalism. Like once capitalism was overthrown, then everything would be okay. This kind of sort of disguised the fact that the SPD was actually a party oriented towards male industrial workers, and underneath it all, they wanted traditional roles. They wanted anyone when they got home for dinner, like 6 o'clock, whatever, they wanted to sign a beer on the table and knockwurst or bratwurst and all that kind of stuff. They were underneath it all, like traditional roles. So they kind of hid the fact. So Clara Zetkin brought up the idea, we need some separate struggle for women. Interestingly, she kind of favored more traditional roles for women as well, but more like she thought a woman is most fulfilled as a mother or caring for a family, but a different social arrangement with socialism would help her with more of a communal, cooperative thing. So she was kind of mixed. She's kind of mixed, but Rosa worked with her, and she brought Rosa, sort of feminist. Rosa did write articles about women's emancipation. It has to be said, though, it wasn't a major interest of Rosa Luxemburg. She didn't write a lot on it. It wasn't a huge interest of her. She wrote about geopolitics and all kinds of other things. It wasn't a big issue of her. Okay, so in 1907, Rosa broke with a relationship with Leo Jokiches. As I said, they were in Poland like in 1905. And apparently Rosa discovered some letters a couple of years later, like Jokiches had, they went separately when they were in Poland, came out, Jokiches stayed with some people. And Rosa asked her, well, he admitted, Leo had to admit, yeah, I stayed with some people. I slept with some people when I was in Poland. Stayed with some comrades in Poland. And then Rosa said, well, were some of these comrades women? And Leo had to admit, yes, Rosa. So he admitted that he had slept with other women. Rosa was pissed. She broke a relationship with him. It was a nasty breakup. It was a really nasty breakup. Like they both, she carried a revolver around for a while. At the same time, they still politically collaborated. Like Rosa was really felt bitterly betrayed, but they collaborated. She held her feelings in check to politically collaborate. They're still comrades. They politically collaborated. They wrote articles together, and they continued like he was an organizer. They still worked together in with both German SPD and then the Polish movement. Okay, and also, I think this was around 1907. Well, a little while later, something really interesting happened. Now, I talked about her friendship with Clara Zetkin, who's a pioneering feminist, socialist feminist, which is different from bourgeois feminism. So, really interesting. There was a tradition in Europe of intellectual women or middle-class women to sleep with the son of a friend so he could lose his virginity. Not really young, but guy got 19, 20, 21. Usually that was the age at that time. And a woman would sleep with the guy, sleep with the son, younger man, losing. But it was understood it was just a short-term thing, a very, very short-term thing. So Rosa, I think she was probably in her late 30s at the time. She slept with Clara Zetkin's son, Kostya. It's supposed to be a one-time thing. And I believe she was in her late 30s, mid to late 30s, probably really late 30s at the time. He was 21. And however, they stayed together. They fell in love with each other. He really admired her politically. Wow, you're really amazing. And they had a relationship. They lived together for 7 years. This was considered, at the context, and I had nothing wrong with it at all, but it's considered kind of tacky in the context, and people were hinted, Rosa, this is not, it was very, very tacky and a bad thing at the time. People would suddenly, what's going on here, Rosa? it finally ended in 1915 when Kostya was drafted in the German army and he went off to war. Kostya, by the way, he's part Russian. His father was Russian. Kostya is a Russian name, Konstantin. But anyway, finally in 1915 when Kostya was drafted, World War I finally ended that. Interesting, Kostya Zetkin was an interesting character. He, after like World War I, he lived in the Soviet Union for a time, but he didn't feel entirely safe there. He was a famous figure, son of Clara Zetkin. He eventually ended up in the U.S. after the Second World War. They gave him a hard time during McCarthyism. He was a leftist. I don't know what he did, but he was involved in leftist politics in the years. I don't know what he did, but I haven't found that on it. But sorry, they kind of gave he was a doctor, but he was harassed by the FBI, and they gave him. He ended up being retired in Canada, in British Columbia, and he died in, I think it was Buffalo Lake, British Columbia in 1980. Yeah. Kind of interesting historical tidbit there. Okay. Also in 1907, Rosa got a job teaching at the party school in Berlin. The party school, not a school with lots of kegs. This was a training school for activists and organizers in the SPD and for union organizers. And she was initially very reluctant to take this job. She was kind of ridiculous teaching, ridiculous. But then she really got into it. She enjoyed it. And it gave her a chance to put her ideas together. And so she wrote 3 books. She was there from 1907 to 1914 when the First World War began. And this gave her a chance to put her ideas together. She wrote 3 books basically partly from her lecture notes. First book was on the history of socialism. I'm not sure about the second book. I believe, interestingly, Rosa got interested in non-Western cultures, the economics of non-Western cultures, indigenous people, Native Americans, the Siberian tribes. She drew on Marx himself, went in this direction, but his stuff, ethnographic notebooks, I believe, wasn't published during his lifetime. It was published much, much later on. So this wasn't available to Rosa, but she was independently going in the same direction as Marx, studying like non-Western cultures and how they organize, how they're organized economically, things like that, things we can learn. Kind of really interesting. I think that was her second book. Her third book is considered her masterpiece, and it's a difficult read. It's an Accumulation of Capital. And I'm going to see if I can explain it, if this makes sense. Okay, so Marx talked about primitive capital accumulation. That is the idea that, before capitalism is on the takeoff, before it takes off and runs on its own, it needs like capital to startup capital, in fact, to start going. And this comes from unequal exchange. There's plundering, theft, stealing. For instance, much of the capital for the Industrial Revolution, which started in the late 18th century in Manchester, England, much of the capital for this came from horrific slave colonies that the British had in the Caribbean, the West Indies, horrific. And once, like later on, like 1830s, the British no longer needed this. They became anti-slavery when they no longer needed it. And ending slavery would hurt their opponents, the French. So kind of hypocrisy there, but also, much earlier, there was the Aztec, Inca gold, the Spaniards got from the New World, looted all that. It actually went to Dutch bankers, the Dutch banking industry, and started, one of the things that started the capitalist revolution. There's so many other examples, like plundering, a whole history of plundering. Marx talking about the people, the Scottish Highlanders were oppressed and really screwed. And but the general idea that once this happens, is, I wouldn't say not a one-time thing, but once it happens, capitalism is an ongoing thing. Rosa thought that like ongoing primitive capital accumulation is necessary to keep capitalism going, like some ongoing, has to be like an ongoing thing. There has to be essentially looting or some unequal exchange from non-capitalist parts of the world, capitalism would not be able to continue, not be able to realize, the companies, capitalists could not fully realize their profits within the capitalist network. They would have to go outside of the capitalist world, essentially exploit the non-capitalist world to continue functioning. If that makes sense. And Rosa's time, Rosa thought that and there was non-capitalist world during the time of Rosa, China, Africa, large areas of the what we call today the global South, were not yet capitalist, were just being incorporated into it. And Rosa kind of thought that like once the whole world was capitalist, which was coming pretty soon, then that would create a huge crisis for the system and capitalism might collapse. So this was, and two things, her take on Marxist crisis theory. She wanted to show, in opposition to Bernstein, the revisionist, that capitalism still had internal crises, and she tried to analyze what it was. This was also her take on theory of imperialism. Europe at that time was starting to carve up Africa, divide Africa, and scramble for Africa and other parts of the world. European colonialism was taking over the entire global South. And what's going on? She tried to explain why this was happening, some of the motivations. Now, it was widely mocked when she wrote it. Actually, it wasn't popular. It does have a lot of insight. It's right, but not in the way that she meant it. Like it was right, like more in our time, like David Harvey, Lauren Goldner, a left communist, so some interesting things. Some other people use Rosa like she was right, but wrong in the context. Like her idea of unequal exchange, continuous unequal exchange, is happening right now in neoliberalism. Like capitalism is cannibalizing itself in effect there. Everything is being commodified. And Rosa explains why increasing commodification, like today, you have like universities, like there's a stadium outside the Boston, north of the Boston area, Great Woods. Now it's Gillette Stadium. Like when I was a little kid, naming a stadium after Razor Blade Company or university after a shoe company would be absurd. We're told now, yeah, everything is commodified. There's sneaker fetishism. Some of my coworkers are into this. Like people spend thousands of dollars for sneakers. I don't get it, but everything is commodified. Everything is all, it's been a trend in U.S. society from the 80s or even earlier. Everything is increasingly commodified. So this Rosa's idea, accumulation of capital, explains this, and David Harvey uses this in a different context than Rosa meant it. She was wrong in the context, but she did have a lot of insight. She got more right in what she got wrong than her opponents did. Okay, let's see. Okay, so the accumulation of capital was her masterpiece. Okay, early 1900s wore on. There were increasing international crises and collisions between the great powers of Europe, and became increasingly apparent during the general European war. Friedrich Engels predicted, like I think 1880s, early 1890s, he predicted a European war in the 20th century. He kind of thought it would be a race war between like Germanic people and Latin people. It didn't play out that way, but he was right. There was a war. And it became, the Socialist movement, Second International, had conventions, conferences where they made declarations they would oppose any war. It would be a capitalist war on behalf of their capitalist masters. The working class doesn't have a stake in this. We're going to oppose war. It's not workers from one country killing workers from another country. But the declarations became increasingly weak. The big one was, I believe, Stuttgart Declaration. I think it was 1907, but I'm not really sure. Okay, so I forgot to mention when I talked about Rosa's struggle with the mass strike, the SDP throughout its history had alternated between being run by the left and the right, Originally, I think when Rosa first joined it, and she had the debate against the fight against the revisionists, it was generally run by the left. By people who were the intellectuals anyway, who were anti-revisionist. Then it moved to the right. It was more taken over by revisionists for a time. I forget who the leader was. Then when Rosa had the fight over the mass strike, the leader was a guy named August Bebel, who was kind of on the left. And he supported Rosa, or kind of supported her, but kind of subtly undercut her at the same time. But he prevented the party from going to hell in a handbasket sooner than it did, probably, some people say. He was on the left, sort of. But then after that, he left and the right revisionists took over. And Rosa, like from about, 1907, after that time, definitely after she came back from Poland, writing on the Polish Revolution, she was in the doghouse. She was under fierce attack by the right in the party. In fact, for a time, she couldn't get anything published. She couldn't get a job. She was an SBPD journalist, but no newspaper would hire her. There's a blackout. They wouldn't publish anything, any of her work. And she and Yoki, just even if they officially broke up, they still worked together. They had this, they started this, I don't know, group whereby they could anonymously send in articles that to different journals, get their ideas out. That didn't really work either. But, and some people said to Rosa, maybe you should start another party. She didn't want to do that, felt it would be dangerously isolated. Famous German sociologist Max Weber, who wrote a lot about bureaucracies. He wasn't a socialist, he was a liberal, he was in the Liberal Party. I think he may have been somewhat sympathetic to socialism at one point. I don't know, but he wrote stuff about the SPD during like 1910, during that period. Basically said, you know, we talked about the bureaucratization of it, that it's increasingly bureaucratized. And no matter, he said, no matter who would be in charge of the party, the left or the right, it would go in a right direction. The bureaucratization, which is an inevitable part of a big organization, would impel it to go in the right direction. And he was right. So Rosa, by the time like 1970 or so, she kind of realized, you know, the party could pass all the resolutions it wanted to. It wouldn't matter. The party was crap. It thoroughly degenerated, and you couldn't recover it. But she didn't want to split, because she would have been dangerously isolated. At least if you're in the party, you can have some access to the work, more access to the working class, maybe get something published, maybe a speaking tours. She did make lots of speaking tours. She was a very fiery speaker, very popular speaker. As I said, she was a little uneasy about speaking crowds, but she was really good at it. She campaigned in Poland. Oh yeah, in the German part of Poland. I did not mention, yeah, I think it was 1907 again. She actually was fine. She wrote an article, so said she was against Polish nationalism, but she did favor cultural autonomy, language rights, and she wrote something really condemning or criticizing the Germanification of the German section of Poland. Like, people were now speaking German, their education was in German, the Polish language was dying out. She strongly opposed it. She wrote against this, and she was fined. Actually, the government fined her for like insulting the German government or something like that. Another time, she actually, early on, she did go to jail for like a few months or something for insulting the monarch, insulting the Kaiser, something stupid like that. Anyway, so by around 1907, 1910 here, she realized the party had degenerated, but she had to keep doing what she was doing. She was really hounded. The leadership really hated her by this point, after Babel left. And the event leading up, then there was the First World War. And it was pretty apparent there would be a war. And finally, the party leadership was increasingly reformist, increasingly waffling. There was a section led by a guy named Gustav Nosk, who was a former butcher. He was called Nosk the Butcher for other reasons, but Gustav Nosk was part of this faction which was very pro-military. He wrote weird stuff like, you know, German workers admire the German army for its discipline, like really cringy stuff like that. And there was a sizable element of the party which was very pro-militaristic, giving out signals that they would welcome a war, that they would support the government. And finally, it came up to it, and it was declared the general mobilization, and Germany declared war, broke out. And the SPD was in panic. What the hell did we do? They got themselves, they walked away from their anti-war stance. They were so close to the state, they wanted to compromise. They didn't know what to do. They figured if they came out against the war, the entire party would be banned, they'd be arrested, and the whole thing would be over. So they said, yeah, we ought to go along with it. And they were kind of in a panic. But on, I think it was April 4th, 1914, the Socialist Party voted for war credits. They voted for like war money to fund the war. This was considered a major betrayal, a huge, huge betrayal in socialist history. And the other socialist parties in Europe kind of did the same thing. They supported their own ruling class. I talked about earlier video, I talked about the Zimmerwald Movement, a very small group of anti-war socialists who said this is not a good thing. But the bulk of the socialist movement, including in Germany, initially supported the war against their fellow workers in other countries. And this was a huge betrayal. Lenin heard about it. Apparently, he was, I think, on a train going through Germany. He heard about it. He didn't believe, he assumed it was propaganda. They would never do that. Rosa wasn't surprised. She lived in Germany. She knew how degenerate the party had become by then, but they voted for war credits. So Rosa was, when the war broke out, she was seriously suicidal. She was devastated. In fact, for about a couple of months afterwards, she was seriously suicidal over it. I remember the whole thing. She felt she had to do something, so she organized a small demonstration against the war. She was arrested and sent to a really brutal prison, actually. I forget where it is. And I think in Berlin or someplace. And there's really, I think she was there 2 years, really harsh conditions. That's when World War I started, 1914, 15, 16, really brutal conditions. And she didn't write anything, as far as I know. Right before she was arrested, right before the war broke out, she got married. She married, I think his name was Hans Diefenbacher. He was a doctor, and he was part of this left-wing network that Rosa had organized. I don't think he was a theory guy, but he was part of this leftist network. Rosa didn't want to start a separate party, but she did organize a network. Best thing with getting people organized, revolutionary network within the party. And Hans Diefenbach, I believe that's his name, her husband, they did get married. He was a doctor. When the war broke out, he was drafted. Oddly, he went and he served, and he was killed pretty early on, sadly. So this was really a devastating time for Rosa. She was in prison for, I think 3 years. Really, first 2 years were really brutal conditions. Later, they moved her to a somewhat better prison. But okay, the war and the SPD, their delegation to Parliament, to the German Reichstag, what it was called, voted for the war credits. The left wing of the party was very unhappy about this, but they felt there was nothing they could do. And the party had something called the Bergfriede, like the Bergfriede, I'm not pronouncing it correctly, the peace of the castle. It was a form of democratic centralism, like Leninist parties have democratic centralism. When things are debated, you have like intense debate, but once the party decides on something, that's it. You can't criticize the party from outside, and you have to go along with what the leadership demands. Once it's decide, you can have lots of discussion before this time, but you have to go along with party discipline. So there's this guy, the leader of the parliamentary left wing in Germany was a guy named Karl Liebknecht. He was the son of Wilhelm Liebknecht, who was one of the founders of the SPD. He was a drinking buddy of Karl Marx, something of a theorist. He had a run-in with early Rosa Luxemburg. Actually, they didn't get along apparently, but his son was a lawyer and a socialist lawyer, and he was a leader of the left wing in the parliamentary delegation. He actually voted for war credits. He hated it. He was torn up inside. This is not a good thing to do, but I have to obey party discipline. Really, he was torn up inside about it. So sometime later, I think it was, so anyway, the war went on year after year, and the party kept voting for war credits. And, they essentially, the SPD controlled the German working class on behalf of the German ruling class during the war. Okay, so and they didn't get anything back from it. The usual bargains. There was increasing party censorship in the newspapers. Some of their leaders were harassed or arrested. There were usually, when there's a bargain like that, and in return, like the party would continue to exist. The government wouldn't arrest them. They continue to exist, and maybe do some labor action in other newspapers. But they were, they had to support the war, solidly support the war. Well, I forget the year. Then it was morphed into the German Revolution, which is kind of complicated. I forget the year. I think it was probably 1916. There's growing war weariness, and Germany began losing a few battles. And there was an incident where there was a bread riot in Berlin, like housewives at bread shortage, and there's a bread truck. Housewives mobbed it. It turned out to be a bread riot. And this provided an opening to the left. And Karl Liebknecht and his friends, they debated this. And the party leadership said, absolutely no. If you vote against the war credits next time, you're out of the parliamentary fraction, and then you're out of the party. Well, Liebknecht and his friends, they met in his apartment. They planned this. I said, we're going to vote against this. They planned. I mean, it wouldn't stop the war. Of course, it wouldn't mean anything, but politically, it was an important gesture. You have to make this gesture to build something. It's not going to stop the war, of course, but they met in Liebknecht's apartment. They planned this out. So sure enough, they voted against the war credits. Small, the left wing, not the whole. The SPD had a large part of the German parliament, but this left wing faction, they voted against it. And there's a shock. Finally, there was a lot of ruckus, and they were finally expelled. The government was kind of pissed off at them too, and they were expelled from the party. They were expelled, and there was a split. SPD had a split. finally, the German socialist movement split. About a third, I think it was about a third of the party left. It was split from the top down. And there's a group called the Independent Socialists came out of it. I believe they were the Bremen branch, part of the Berlin branch, a few other branches, more radical younger workers. The split, it was top down, and it wasn't initially explained, like democratically explained to people. Some people just found themselves in a different party, like how the hell this happened. It worked itself out. And a group called the Independent Socialists, it was a USPD in German, and they were, interestingly, the centrists, the left and the centrists. So when Rosa Luxemburg got out of jail, she was released, I think, in 2017 or something. I don't remember, but she was released in jail. She joined the Independent Socialists. Oddly, Kautsky and Bernstein, they're still around. They were in the same party for a time as Rosa, oddly. Then, okay, so what happened? A whole series of things happened, really complicated. There was a Russian Revolution of 22 revolutions in 1917, February, and then October, beginning into the year. This was especially October Revolution was electrifying effect in Germany. What happened is workers' councils started taking over everywhere. There was the Kiel Mutiny. Okay, kind of complicated. There was a mutiny in the German Navy. Hair on my face here. There was a mutiny, basically. Okay, mutiny in the Germany had lost the war. In fact, it was understood Germany now had lost. There were a huge number of demobilized soldiers and sailors all over the place. It was chaos, and civil authority was breaking down. The leaders of the German Navy had this idea. I've heard different versions of it. They want to send the ships, Navy, into the English Channel and have like a last chaotic battle with the British, or another version, they would send the ships into the English Channel and scuttle the ships. Either way, it would have killed the sailors on. It was good, but they wanted to do it for the glory of the honor of the German Navy. Well, the sailors kind of had other ideas, and there was a mutiny. It succeeded. The Kiel Mutiny, it succeeded, and the sailors quickly took over the town of Kiel. It was a seaport in northern Germany. Northeastern Germany, and they took over Kiel, and then this spread everywhere. It was an example from the Russian Revolution that had an electrifying effect, and workers' councils started taking over local governments, big governments, took everything. It was good, not as good as it sounds, it's chaotic, and there wasn't a revolutionary party to lead things. Meanwhile, the German army, the German army had put, the very end of they lost, they put the SPD in charge. Seriously, this is bizarre. Socialist government, where Germany finally had a socialist government. Not as good as it sounds. Germany finally had a socialist government, not as good as it sounds. So the Woodrow Wilson had one of his, it was supposed to be an armistice, but Woodrow Wilson said, the Kaiser has to abdicate, and he did. So they put two social SPD leaders, both were bureaucratic hacks. It was Franz Ebert and forget the other guy's name, Franz Ebert, anyway, big guy. He was previously Scheidemann. Franz Ebert and Gustav Scheidemann. Ebert was a big guy, one of those walrus mustaches they had back then. He was famous. His famous quote was, "I hate revolution like the plague." Okay, he was now the Chancellor of Germany. They just installed the German army. Okay, yeah, you put him in. Okay, you guys have it. The German army is kind of running Germany during the war anyway. And they, okay, we'll put the socialists in charge when we were out of here. He apparently, Ebert wanted to keep the monarchy. And Scheidemann, now, okay. So Karl Liebknecht, one incident when this is going on, he got up on a balcony and said, I declare the Socialist Republic. Well, this was happening, and obviously it was just a gesture. He wasn't a Socialist Republic, it was a gesture. So to forestall that, this guy Scheidemann, he was having soup at a restaurant. Some journalists asked him what type of government Germany has. They were now in charge. What type of government is Germany going to have? It's a republic. He said, we're going to have a republic. He did that to cut short Liebknecht. Okay, well, Franz Zimmerwald was pissed. He wanted to keep the monarchy. A socialist wanted to keep the monarchy. Okay, that's the situation. That's the situation we're going into. Liebknecht he was arrested, by the way, and he protested against the war. He was arrested. They put him in a punishment battalion, hard labor. He was in his 40s and not in great health, and they put him in this punishment battalion. So finally, the things are falling apart, and the government finally had an amnesty. Liebknecht was released. Rosa Luxemburg was released. All these radicals people who were released from prison, political prisoners. And that's a situation. So Rosa was released into that situation. A whole very chaotic time, very chaotic time. So she initially joined the USPD. Leo Yuki just organized this group called the Spartacus League. After Spartacus, the Roman gladiator, Spartacus Bund in German, I believe. No connection with there's a group organization today, the Sparts. If you spend time on the left, the Spartacus League, or they hate to be called the Sparts, but the Sparts, the International Communist League, as they call themselves, they have no connection. They just took the name from Rosa Luxemburg's group, but there's no continuity. There's no connection. A lot of people get confused by that. Okay, so things became German Revolution, hit a revolutionary climate, which lasted for a while, actually. Russia had the Russian Revolution. This had an electrifying effect on Russia, on Germany. Germany had lost the war. The masses of demobilized soldiers. The economy was going to hell. There was and large working class people wanted socialism. So there was workers' councils everywhere. There was a group. There was a delegate group in Berlin, which was in the circus. I forget the name of it. It was the mass meetings where supposedly delegates from the workers all over Germany were meeting to decide what type of government that Germany's going to have. Whether there a council, whether it was going to be a council republic, like run by workers' councils, like Soviets, or whether it was going to be by territory, like a bourgeois democracy. Finally, the people who favored bourgeois democracy won out, but it was extremely chaotic and was a weird, didn't really mean that much. Meanwhile, what was going on is the SPD and who were run by right-wing bureaucratic hacks by this time, who hated revolution, and the German army were cooperating to crush out the revolution, crush this out, while pretending to favor it. Basically, these workers' councils, the army and the SPD working together, usually co-opted it. They were able. There's a great book by Pierre Bruy called The German Revolution, which describes a lot of this and how they crushed the socialists, social democrats crushed the revolution. They crushed these groups, co-opted workers' councils. We'll nationalize. We'll put this put the industry under workers' control, but we have to do it legally. We got to vote on it. Blah 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 blah. Made sure it never happened. So that was going on. And when they couldn't co-opt it, they sent in the military to crush it. There was a group called the Freikorps, who were right-wing private armies. They came from like wealthy aristocratic students, they were imperialist shock groups, and they morphed into sort of bizarre right-wing proto-fascist organizations. They weren't Nazis, but they were the milieu from which the Nazis came out of. So when the SPD and the army couldn't co-opt these workers' councils, they sent in the Freikorps groups to crush it. And it was led by Gustav Nosk the butcher. He had been a butcher before he became a party bureaucrat. He was very pro-military, and he led the crushing of these groups called Nosk the butcher for several different meanings. Okay, so Rosa, she was released from prison. Leo Yuki just quickly organized Spartacus League, mostly in Berlin. They were in Berlin. All over Germany, these radical groupsicles were popping up. And there's one group, Rosa's group was the Spartacus League, which was the predecessor of the KPD, the German Communist Party. In fact, it became Spartacus League KPD. And they had an alliance with the group called the Revolutionary Shop Stewards. And the incident in Berlin, the chief of police was USPD, Independent Socialist, on the left wing of it. He later joined the Communist Party. He was in the far left of the the USPD. And the German government began Berlin's the capital, of course, began cracking down. They chose that. They fired the chief of police. We got an SPD hack, And they used the left wing, it used this as a trigger to resist. And there was an uprising. I think it lasted about 2 weeks, a Spartacus Week or Spartacus Uprising in Berlin. The Spartacus League was organized with several groups with the revolutionary shop stewards and the left USPD in Berlin, and they fought street battles. This was an uprising and the board of the German Revolution. There's street fighting for about 2 weeks. It was botched. They didn't, they didn't block the means of communication. They should have taken like a telegraph office, a telephone office. They should have blocked the railroad tracks. They started to do it, but it was too late. It was chaotic and not very well disciplined. Okay, so a couple of things happened. This guy character, Karl Radek, I didn't mention him, but he's a pivotal character. He was originally a Polish socialist. He was in the Polish Socialist Party, and there were like years earlier. Maybe he was younger, but years earlier. And there was some incident where he stole someone's coat and books at a socialist meeting. This Radek affair, this whole very murky what went on. But apparently he was expelled from the PSP. He went to Germany and was on, like Rosa, he was a journalist, worked for these SPD papers. He was on the far left wing, and he was a political ally of Rosa. He was an ally, but came out that in one of these fights with the revisionists, the right wing of the party found this out about Radek, that he had been previously expelled. And if you're expelled from one socialist party, theoretically, you can't join another in the international. So this triggered this huge fight. It's called the Radek affair, and Rosa, it was embarrassing to Rosa. And Rosa kind of hated Karl Radek. She hated him. So, okay, so when the SPD first came to power, the army basically put them in power, but they pretended to be revolutionaries, and they welcomed the Russian Revolution, the workers' government, the Russians sent an ambassador. Then they ended relationships with the Soviet Union. They ended it. So Karl Radek came as like the unofficial Soviet ambassador. He was like the representative, the Bolsheviks' representative to the German Revolution. And Rosa initially wouldn't talk to him. Rosa hated him. Rosa wouldn't talk to him. Eventually they did talk, though. Eventually they met in the Soviet embassy, and they had some intense discussions. Basically, they talked about, Karl talked about in the Bolshevik Revolution, 1817, in that year, there's what's called the July Days. Long story, but there was a anarchist commune, which was popular among the working class of Petrograd, had been raided, people were arrested, workers were pissed off. And this was on top of a whole series of other things. So there was a workers' uprising over it. And Lenin kind of realized they couldn't win. The working class could not take, at this time, they could take the cities, but they wouldn't be able to take the countryside, just wasn't ready for it. So what they did is they put themselves, the Bolsheviks kind of put themselves at the head of this uprising and kind of deflated it. And people were, deflated, like, no, we're not going to make sure it didn't, all right, go home, everybody kind of de-escalated. They felt they had to. There was a wave of reaction after that. Of course, the Kautsky government being hunting down, like Trotsky was arrested, Lenin had to flee, everybody had to flee. But later on, though, it came out that towards the end of the year, the Kautsky government began imploding, and the Soviets had a chance to take power. So Radek kind of explained this to Rosa during the Spartacus Uprising. Basically said, it's not going to work. You got to bring this thing down. You got to close this down. Save your power and live for another day. He convinced her. It's not okay, and finally he convinced her. So that's what she tried to do. She tried to deflate it. Also, she met with, interestingly, Felix Dzerzhinsky, who was an earlier her friend and colleague in her group, the Social Democratic Party of the Kingdom of Poland and Lithuania, whatever. And he was in the Polish Socialist Movement. He went to the Soviet Union, and he joined like Karl Radek. He went to join the Bolsheviks. He went to Russia, joined the Bolsheviks, and he came back. He was head of the Cheka, the political police. And Rosa met with him initially. Was really pissed off at him, like Felix, what the hell are you doing? Like the idea that Cheka was massacring people, and there were a lot of atrocities in the Russian Civil War. There were a lot of atrocities during that period. Victor Serge talks about this on both sides of the war. It was an extremely messy situation. So Rosa and Felix talked for a while, and Felix, they convinced her that we have to do this. We have to, do some horrible things to keep power. It's not a good situation, but look what we're up against. We're up against reactionary forces. So many reactionary forces were in survival mode. And this convinced Rosa. She supported the Russian Revolution. Liberals claim she didn't. She supported the Russian Revolution, was initially appalled at what she thought was the brutality and human rights abuses. But finally she came, yeah, this is necessary. She said, like, whatever deformations are going on with the Russian Revolution, they'll be overcome with a successful German Revolution. She was right, but of course the German Revolution was not successful. Anyway, as I said, she tried to de-escalate the Spartacus Uprising. Interestingly, and Karl Liebknecht was part of this, he sabotaged her attempts to de-escalate. Said, no, keep fighting, keep fighting. He totally sabotaged it. And she was pissed off at him. She wrote him this angry note that, Karl, you are too undisciplined. I'm ending my political relations with you. Anyway, the uprising collapsed, and the Freikorps, the rebels didn't cut off the train tracks. The Freikorps was able to control the railroad. They burned trainload after trainload of Freikorps troops, and they retook the city in about a couple of weeks. And Rosa and Karl Liebknecht were arrested. Karl Liebknecht was, quote, arrested. They were held at a hotel Adlon, and he was, quote, shot while trying to escape. Rosa was killed a few days later. They clubbed her in the head. She came back, when she regained consciousness, they shot her, and they dumped her body, both their bodies, in the canal. He just stayed in Berlin for another 2 weeks. He could have left, but he was kind of fatalistic, like everybody close to him in his life and killed. He was kind of fatalistic, and he stayed in Berlin another 2 weeks, and he was finally killed. That part of the German Revolution was crushed. Okay, well, long story and off the subject matter, but Germany had a revolutionary climate, at least until 1923. A guy named Paul Levi, Rosa Spartacus League, became the KPD, the German Communist Party. There was the USPD had a split. The Independent Socialists, there's a famous debate. Zinoviev, one of the Bolsheviks leaders, had a debate with Martov, the Menshevik leader, in Halle in Germany, debating like which way, debate before the Independent Socialists, and whether they should go with the communists or go with the Social Democrats. And interestingly, about 2/3 of the USPD joined the Communist Party. The KPD became a mass party. Well, a guy named Paul Levi, who was probably Rosa Luxemburg's lover for a while, he led the KPD after Luxemburg Liebknecht were killed. And they had some there's a powerful ultra-left, very, very powerful ultra-left, the one like, let's take power, and even when I was ready for it. People were disgusted at the Social Democrats, and Rosa fought against this ultra-left tendency. And so did Paul Levi, became ferocious. And there was something called the March Action, where the KPD literally tried to force a revolution. They went into factories and forced people to go on strike. They just beat up workers and forced them to go on strike, and it collapsed. The whole thing was a disaster. The whole thing was a complete disaster, and the party lost a lot of members. And Paul Levy was horrified at this. He was the leader. He was horrified at this. Radek played a weird kind of role. He was arrested. He met with right-wing industrialists or members of the German right, and tried to convince them to, go ally with the Soviet Union, like called National Bolshevism, Nazbols, the West will never accept Germany as equal country. You ought to go along with the Soviet Union. He may be partially successful. Anyway, he played an odd role in some ways. Really, really complicated, but Paul Levy was really disgusted at this ultra-leftism in his party. He did some incident where he publicly betrayed party secrets. He published stuff. He was just so pissed off. He was expelled from the party, and he and a group rejoined the SPD, like a left faction of the SPD. Anyway, the revolutionary moment was really chaotic. There was, at the very end, like 1923, the French, Germany signed the Treaty of Versailles, which really brutally punishing treaty, and they fell behind the reparations payments to France, occupied the coal mining region, the Ruhr Valley. This triggered a hyperinflation, and this renewed the revolutionary crisis. There's an opportunity. Communist Party was led by a guy named Oscar Brandler, And if they had, that was the time to lead an uprising. While Oscar Brandler, if I remember, he was running around Moscow looking for someone to tell him what to do. The moment passed, 1923 passed. The Weimar Republic reached some stability, and the revolutionary moment in revolutionary era in Germany definitively ended. Everyone knew it. Like the Soviet Union knew, we're on our own. There's not going to be a revolution in Germany. Germans are not going to help us. The West isn't going to help us. We're on our own. This had a powerful impetus to the rise of Stalin. They were like, we're completely on our own. It's between socialism in one country or socialism internationally. Big debate over this. Led a powerful impetus to the rise of Stalin and the rise of bureaucracy in the Soviet Union. So it was a major turning point in history. History would have been a lot different if Rosa Luxemburg had succeeded, or if the German Revolution had succeeded at some point in time in triggering a socialist revolution. It probably would have been pretty bloody, but history today would have been vastly different. Okay, so that's about it. See, I'm going to have to do a lot of editing, but that's about it. Yeah, but read more about it. The classic work on Rosa Luxemburg is by Paul Froelich. He was a German revolutionary, came to the US. I don't know if I pronounce his name, Frohlich. Paul Froelich. It's called Rosa Luxemburg. It's pretty amazing. Good introduction to her life. There's a graphic novel called Red Rosa, which is really good too. I mean, glosses over, has to be kind of broad as a graphic novel, but it's really good. I forget I forget the author, Kate Hill. I forget her name, but I'll provide a link. That's really good. There's also a book by J.P. Nettle. I have it here somewhere. I'm not sure where it is, but book by J.P. Nettle. Again, it's called Rosa Luxemburg. He discusses more in depth her political struggles. It's really a good read. It focuses a little too much on political intrigue and makes everyone seem like they're an opportunist, but I got something out of it. And really, really interesting book. Then there's a History of the SPD by Karl Schorsky. That's Schorske. He was an American historian of the German SPD, and it's not specifically about Rosa Luxemburg, but she's kind of the main character. And he discussed the ups and downs in the SPD. The SPD from like when it was 1883, I think, to 1914, the history of it from that period. And amazing book, and Rose is the pivotal figure in this. Other people played a role too. It's really, really good. So combine all these together, I think you get a good view of her. And I do think, people pose as like a libertarian alternative to the authoritarian Lenin. That's not really true. She was probably more centralized than Lenin was. He was more of a centralized of Lenin, allowed Finland, Poland to become independent. That might not have been a good idea because Finland was used as a base to attack Russia. So was Poland. So there are complicated debates. They both believed in socialist emancipation. They were under working in totally different vastly different situations and doing different things. Lenin's model party organizing was much better. He led a successful revolution, while she didn't. But they were doing different things in different situations. And he had this great, Lenin had this great eulogy, like she soars like an eagle. I wish I had it. I don't have it with me, but she soars like an eagle. My eulogy for her after she died. Trotsky claimed her as a spiritual ancestor of the Fourth International. I think he was probably right. They would have had, assuming alternate history, if Rosa had lived, but the German Revolution was crushed, she probably would have joined the Fourth International. She wouldn't be like Bordiga or Victor Serge, who were tiny ultra-left group. She knew the danger of being politically isolated. She probably would have had sharp debates with Trotsky, but she probably would have joined the Fourth International. It's pretty interesting. You can think of the best alternate history, and there's several like this online, that if the German Revolution succeeded, like there's this thing called Reality Rosa. It's on, you just type that in Google, it's an alternate history for Rosa Luxemburg's revolution had succeeded, and then the history would have been vastly different. I don't know if it was possible at that time. She lived during and right before, and really right before a period of enormous flux and change from like 1914 to like 1948 or so, the two world wars, depression, revolutions, counter-revolutions. And Bernstein was wrong. He helped disarm the working class on the eve of the biggest struggle of all. So anyway, some interesting stuff. I'm going to make more videos soon. I'm going to take kind of a hiatus. I got to work on some other stuff for the next couple of weekends, unless there's some major thing happening in the news, in the crisis, and there probably will be. But I will be making videos. I'm going to take a hiatus for a couple of weeks. Anyway, thanks. Hope you enjoy. Please like and subscribe. Thank you.